Welcome into the Husker247 Podcast. I'm Michael Bruntz, joined by Brian Christopherson on a January Tuesday where we're going to spend a bulk of today talking about the portal, as it seems like we do every podcast, but lots to hit on at the edge rusher position, the wide receiver spot, guys moving away from Nebraska after coming out of the portal. So we'll hit on all that in a minute. Just a reminder, subscribe to our YouTube channel if you're watching it on YouTube, as Brian takes a sip of his coffee out of a fantastic coffee mug. Also, the podcast is available to subscribe. It's free wherever you get your podcast, Spotify, Apple, any of those places. So hit us there. It's free. It's spectacular. So
you can't complain if it's free.
Yeah. So that being said, let's get into the news of the week so far. Nebraska lands former very high 4-star edge rusher MJ Sherman from Georgia. He of 2 national championship rings. The Nebraska closed this one quickly. He was in the portal for a very, very short amount of time after Georgia won the national title. Nebraska pounced, got him to Lincoln, and he left committed. So kind of break this one down for us, Brian. The edge position, which we'll get into too, is kind of been in flux. And I think Nebraska's done a good job of addressing needs there, but where does MJ Sherman kind of fall in the pecking order of transfers that Nebraska's gotten so far this offseason?
Well, I think we Husker fans should be first excited by the fact that you got a player who is like number 33 overall in the 247 Sports Composite in the 2020 class. So we're talking, he was a high-end 4-star, almost 5-star-ish prospect who ran like a verified 4.53 40 in high school. He did have an ACL injury at one point there, I think his junior year, but just a stud prospect. And obviously at Georgia, everybody in college football knows that's a program right now where you could be the 4th or 5th guy at your position group and still be pretty solid. Like, you could be a salty player. You're just behind some guys who are going to be first-round picks. So that's what you're hoping for if you're a Nebraska fan, is he's that type of guy who was really good and he just sort of got lost in the clutter there of talent at Georgia. I think you can also I understand Nebraska fans are like, I'm excited, but let's not act like just because he had big time recruiting credentials or he came from that program that he's like automatically the first or second guy, or he's going to be like a second team all Big Ten type player. So I think we can fall somewhere in the middle is where I take it. Like, you can say, hey, it's a fresh slate, first off, with Matt Rule and this staff and how they evaluate and bring in portal guys and how they might develop them. That doesn't mean they're going to have success, but it doesn't mean they're going to fail either. So I think you can say, let's wipe the board clean and see how it goes with those type of players. And it sounds like, Bruntz, MJ Sherman's, like, if nothing else, he's got potential, but he's also like it sounds like from a great family and just like a guy, like our Georgia writers were really excited for him. It seemed like that he was getting this opportunity. He leaves that program with the respect of a lot of people. And we've got some stories I've posted here and there, and you have too, from our Georgia site that shows sort of what he's all about. So I think Husker fans are going to like him from that end at least.
Yeah, it's if nothing else, you're getting a guy who I think is going to fit in really easily in a locker room that you're adding 33 new scholarship guys and counting at this point.
Mm-hmm.
And it's funny, when it kind of came out that he was visiting, you started to hear from the Georgia writers of like, okay, this is a good kid, and this is a kid that Nebraska would be really fortunate to get. And it just as kind of an example, I guess, of kind of what Georgia's working with right now. The other Georgia transfer who was visiting, Brett Seether, the tight end who ended up committing to Georgia Tech, in his recruiting class, he was a 3-star recruit, and he was one of, what was it, 4 3-stars in the entire class.
Yeah,
like
Bennett, Stetson Bennett was one of them.
Yeah, so I mean, you're getting a sense, I guess, of how kind of the other side lives in terms of recruiting and talent acquisition. And a guy like MJ Sherman just kind of got caught up in the wash, I guess. He played a lot of special teams. I think loved being at Georgia from all indications. Would have been fine staying there, but Georgia brought in younger talent, kind of said, hey, you need to make a decision here, because it looked like he was maybe getting a little bit farther down the pecking order as an older guy, which is never good. So he gets a new shot at Nebraska as an edge rusher at a position that Nebraska has a ton of need for. And my sense is that when Tony White came in, and knowing what he wants to do defensively, or has done in the past at least, you need to have guys like MJ Sherman to make that defense really work.
Yeah, no question. I mean, he's got a great frame, first off. He's like, 6'2", 250, I think was what he was listed at. And he did give his all, too, towards special teams. He only played 42 snaps on defense last year for Georgia. So he was down on the depth chart there. And I think he played 91 snaps the year before that. So he's not quite like, on the other side of the ball, like Ben Scott coming in from Arizona State's played, 2,000 snaps or whatever it is at this point. Sherman's different than that. But yeah, you're right about the position group. Garrett Nelson was second team All Big Ten. I said we shouldn't just expect MJ Sherman to be that. Well, Garrett Nelson was that. So you're trying to replace that. Caleb Tanner was a guy who, he flashed some really good moments. You could say it was up and down throughout his career, but by the end of it, you had a guy who was a veteran of the Big Ten, who'd been around it for 5 years and knew the ins and outs. And there's something to be said for that. So they're going to be calling on Sherman, Kai Wallen, coming in. Let me look at who else I had. Chief Borders from Florida, could be a guy there. And then you've got like Len Hart, Maverick Noonan, Prince Will, and of course, Jamari Butler and Blaze Gunnerson are returnees. And so I think if nothing else, this addition plus Borders plus Wallen, maybe that allows the guys who are coming right out of high school a little room to breathe. Because you've got some, at least now, 3 players you've brought in who have some college experience, whether it's JUCO or otherwise. And so that could be helpful. But we'll see. Everybody's going to have something to prove, though. I don't think you should say like a favorite right now of who's like 1, 2, 3, 4. I think it's so wide open. And that was probably a lot of the appeal to MJ Sherman, that it was so wide open.
Yeah, and the guy that you mentioned in that list, who I'm most intrigued to see in a new defense and a different defense than what Nebraska had run previously, is Jamari Butler. When you saw him go into the transfer portal, I guess I was a little bit surprised, and maybe I shouldn't have been, by some of the offers he was picking up. I mean, it was a lot of Power 5 offers. He had a couple SEC offers in there, and I think he's a guy who is kind of that classic, he came in undersized. I don't know that he was a perfect fit for what they were running, but he seems like a guy that has just gotten better and better. He's gotten a little bit bigger each year. And I think with kind of a fresh look from a new staff, I think he could fit a 3-3-5 really well, because he runs well. He's got at least the experience of having to, try to set the edge and play on the line a little bit in the Big Ten. But, I think he's probably the most fascinating guy in that group, aside from the new guys who you want to see, how they run around and that kind of thing. But I think Butler could be, a really important save for Nebraska out of the portal, because, I just think you need some continuity there. And I think he did enough and showed enough in fits and spurts to think that maybe his best football is still ahead of him a little bit.
The thing about Jamari, I always notice too, I was disappointed at first when he went in the portal, of course, came back, but at first because some guys you notice during game days are really just like engaged and like part of like boosting up the team and stuff like that. And I really always noticed that about Jamari Butler. Like I felt
Yeah.
like he was a guy who was very active in like wanting Nebraska to succeed. So I knew he had other reasons when he first considered, he's just like, I got to get going. I got to jumpstart this and play some more. But yeah, him and Gunnarsson are both interesting because if you look at their like snap counts last year, they were always sort of in that 8 to 12 range. That's how many they would get per, contest. And so no doubt both those players are thinking like, this is the year to hike that up, and it's going to be wide open at that spot. And what makes it interesting is you could say edge is a weak spot until proven otherwise. But there's other spots in that defense where on the back end, especially like Evan Cooper's group, when he was going through the names and who's returning, I was like, he's got stuff to work with on the back end. Like that should be, there's no reason that shouldn't be a formidable group in the secondary. So if they can get their act together and find 3 or 4 really reliable edge guys, and then build off of that, it'll be huge for this defense, which is actually, it's got pieces coming back that make it a pretty interesting group for Tony White.
For sure. And I think too, from that conversation that Cooper had, I think this defensive staff kind of appreciates the way that the defense kind of played at the end of last season. I mean, they played well. They played hard. That's something that, it's a little bit of coach speak, saying that, they play hard, that maybe not as, productive, etc. But I do think that defense by the end of last season was playing pretty darn well. And I think they were bought into a system that I don't know that it was dramatically different than maybe what Tony White would have run. Like I think at times they had pieces that were playing kind of similar to how White will have guys playing. So we'll see. But getting Sherman I think is huge, and also just with the the speed with which they kind of jumped on him was pretty impressive because, he's a week away from having won a national championship and all of a sudden he's a Nebraska Cornhusker. So it's kind of funny how the portal works that way.
Yeah. And they've had a strong SEC contingent from some of their portal moves already. And also it kind of moved the conversation on from we could use, I don't know how we wanted to.
That's a good segue. We can get to that.
I mean, it did move the conversation from Walter Rouse, of course, changing his mind and deciding he was going to go to Oklahoma instead. I'm not here to bash a guy for changing or whatever. People can speculate as to the reasons as to why. I was surprised because I talked to him a couple times last week, and I could tell he was torn on the decision, Bruntz. Like, even on that Wednesday when he announced for Nebraska, he said after the fact that he had planned to do it earlier, and he was still weighing things. Like, he was going back and forth. So he didn't announce it till after like dinner time. And I thought that was kind of interesting, but he seemed in a good place with it because I talked to him at like 11 p.m. Wednesday night. So in the span of like 36 hours, because Friday is when he said he sort of switched gears, Oklahoma had figured out how to change his mind, which you can do in this portal game until they're here, right? I mean, that's he was still, I guess, up for grabs, supposedly, and that shows, I guess, Nebraska's on the wrong end of this one, but the recruiting fight is never over until a guy's there. And then honestly, in this portal era, sometimes it's still not over because a guy could go somewhere for a year and then he goes to the other place. So that's the world we live in now.
Yeah. My sense is that Oklahoma was probably going to be his pick early in the week. Is that fair to say? Like, I think Nebraska, if you're thinking of it like a horse race, kind of came down the backstretch and pulled ahead on that, what was a Wednesday when he actually decided?
I got the sense, nothing against anybody because everybody hears different info. I got the sense on Monday and Tuesday, we were thinking Nebraska's in this, and some people aren't thinking they are, and they should. But I understand why they were thinking that. I agree with you. I feel like outside of our bubble, there was a belief that for a while it was maybe Oklahoma and Iowa was really where it was going to get decided. And we, through our interview with Rouse and we just kind of thought, I don't think we didn't know it was going to be Nebraska for sure, but I think we definitely thought it was a possibility. And so when he picked them, I wasn't stunned by that. I was surprised Saturday. I mean, you've seen everything covering recruiting, so anything can happen. But that was sort of a new one because of the portal era to me, like of a guy who I don't know. I don't think Nebraska's ever had a portal guy yet, have they? Who is like he's in and then he's not. When it seems so definitive that it was already settled.
Yeah. Well, and he was basically moving to Lincoln the next day.
Yeah,
So
with his mom
plan.
and grandma on Sunday, he was supposed to move in. So it was he's a guy who had a lot of experience and we thought could be the left tackle. He had a injury he's going to have to recover from during the spring. So there was that setback. But I think, Matt Rule's staff understands this is a building process, and every day is going to bring like, oh, that's good, oh, that's bad. There's going to be this juggling act of that stuff, and you really can't just like wallow in anything like that for more than 5 minutes because there's on to the next thing. And I think this staff is very much like that, and really that's the way, whether you're a first-year staff or a 10th-year staff in college football, you have to operate now because it is so changing by the hour with everybody. Like I even hesitate, Bruntz, to say guys' individual names on the roster anymore because I'm sometimes like, is he for sure on the roster?
Yeah.
Like we're actually to that point where I wonder about stuff.
We destroyed a lot of bandwidth last week with how important Rouse was to that offensive line picture.
He wasn't that important. Just kidding.
I believe we're obligated to say that. Yes. Nebraska will be fine. Yeah. But I mean, in all seriousness, no, I mean, you're not going to have Walter Rouse at left tackle. What does this kind of do to your thinking of, as we sit here on January 17th, where Nebraska's offensive line stands as they start offseason conditioning?
Well, the health of Prohaska is big. I mentioned last week, I thought, he's had those 2 back-to-back injuries, but I hope that the second one, because it happened early enough in the fall, I'm hoping that the time it's given him on the calendar is useful for him to really get both those injuries squared away, and mentally. And I only say that because he said it himself. I wouldn't go there otherwise. But yeah, like he said, it was a mental challenge dealing with that first injury last fall. So hopefully when he comes back, it's just like, I'm off and running, Yeah, I think him at left tackle, Scott at center is still huge. I mean, that still gives you the flexibility where you don't have to necessarily worry about that piece. You could put Nuri in on the interior somewhere, New Ely. I still like Corcoran kind of going inside if you can figure out a way to do it. But that's where you kind of wanted that one more tackle, I think, where you felt like obviously Ben Hart's still there and you just need him to climb the ladder. But Corcoran inside, isn't that where you'd like him?
Yeah, I mean that to me was the biggest impact of the Rouse decision, was that it gave you a lot more flexibility of what to do with Corcoran, which ideally I think you move him to guard. And now it's a little bit up in the air what you do in my mind, because if you're going into the spring assuming that Teddy Prohaska is your left tackle, and Bryce Benhart has been the leader in the clubhouse at right tackle, in my mind you could put Corcoran inside, but at the same time I think you also have to acknowledge that he's probably one of 3 tackles that you're looking at potentially starting next season if you don't add anybody else. So that to me is why that decision was a big one to get him, and then for him to go to Oklahoma, is it just brings a little bit more doubt in how you put that puzzle together this spring.
Yeah. I thought it was big from having that tackle body with a lot of experience when you had Rouse in the fold. So he wasn't in the fold. He didn't end up here, and that's the way it is. And um, you got to just keep developing some guys too. They're bringing in a lot of linemen. They're young guys, but you do need some of those third or fourth year or older college guys who have been around right now to set this foundation. While that class, which is very promising on paper, of freshmen, a lot of local guys, well, they get a year or two to grow. And that's where you got to get that cycle going, where you feel like you've got juniors and seniors up front starting for the most part, a couple guys building behind the wings who are ready to go their third year, and then it just keeps spinning that way. And that's what's got to happen.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of that way at a lot of positions, really. I mean, if you dig into the way the roster is kind of put together right now, I mean, it feels very kind of barbelly almost, where you've got, veteran guys at some spots, a lot of young guys, but there's just not that kind of in between group. And that's why, kind of missing on some of the guys that you did in 2020 and 2021 and guys transferring out, that's where it hurts you. It's not right away. It's a couple of years down the road where it's that time for those guys to step up, and they're playing elsewhere. I mean, that's really kind of been Nebraska's big issue in my mind, and how they've been able to develop and kind of nourish talent.
Yeah. Well, there's also, I mean, this is what's so fascinating about Husker football right now is since Rule took over, someone asked me today, are you expecting news of some sort? And I was like, basically every day I expect something. Like,
Yeah.
It's not like there's something specific I'm necessarily thinking, but it's some days there are. But it just feels like something's going to happen. And over Sunday and Monday, let's talk receivers, Bruntz.
Okay.
Xavier Betts is on track and appears like he's going to be part of the program. I've been told Garcia Castaneda is part of the program. And there's pictures from like the Huskers account, right, with both of those guys.
They were both volunteering yesterday with the rest of the football team. So
that's probably a giveaway. So I don't think we're like breaking anything here. But let's start with Xavier Betts.
We'll go back to Friday, because you had a report about kind of where things were with him, and I think the backstory of Matt Rule also, and the way that he's kind of handled situations like this in the past, kind of needs to be said in terms of how it relates to Xavier Betts.
Yeah. They met multiple times, I was told, face to face, and
Xavier and Rule.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I don't think any stone was unturned from what I've gathered. And I just feel like really the parameters are there. The support system is set up. It's like we're going to put guys around you to have you succeed, but there's also going to be accountability. You got to understand there's going to be accountability. And I just think it sounded like there was a mutual good feeling about the possibility of making it take off. And I think what you're getting to in the question, and I've tried to stress this the last week or so, Rule's staff, coming from Temple, they had a lot of, I don't know what number you'd put it at, but they had a bunch of players who came from tough circumstances, and some in the Philly area. And there were guys who had zigzags to have success. They weren't just like a straight line where it just worked for them automatically. Like Robbie Anderson, who's in the NFL, I've used him as a good example. He's a wide receiver who went home early in his Temple career and wasn't with the team for a while. Maybe similar to Xavier's situation a little bit there. And he stayed in contact. Robbie Anderson did with Rule, and Rule brought him back, gave him a second chance, and he really flourished, and he became an NFL player. Hassan Reddick's a guy who had, I think, a second chance given him, and there's plenty more you could point out. But I just don't think they're going to be phased, Bruntz, by like situations like this. They feel like they've had success with guys who, for one reason or another, have had difficulty, stepped away, or there's something that's it's just has kept them from success on the field or not wanting to be on the field. And so and it's an in-state guy with Xavier. Like, think about the success story that is if Xavier could come back and take off, of like a guy who went to Bellevue West and everybody was so excited about his talents, and you think it's over, and then he comes back. And if there's any sort of success there, it'll be one of those examples that we point to, like sort of the Robbie Anderson thing at Temple is always brought up.
Yeah, and I mean, let's be honest too. I mean, that's a position where you need a lot of help, and Xavier Betts, just based on what he's done, early in his Nebraska career, would be the second or third most productive receiver on the roster right now in a Nebraska uniform.
Yeah, I mean,
I think he has more career catches than Alante Brown, right?
He probably does. He was fourth, I think, that one year. And then there was sort of the expectation he was going to be one of the top two guys last year before he left in the spring. And I just think you always got the sense with Xavier when he did interviews, he was pretty candid about stuff when he was sort of like searching, like to motivate himself to play this game. And, some guys are really great at football, but you got to really want it and love it. And, sometimes you can step away from something for a bit and that comes back to you sort of, and we'll see if that happens here. I think that you got to have that component to succeed, as much talent as you have. But you're right. He would be, like, from a stats point, one of their top three guys. And so if either him or Garcia Castaneda, who we'll get to in a second, if either one of those two took off, and you got Billy Kemp now in the fold from Virginia, Marcus Washington, Alante, you got something to work with then if you could get a couple of the young guns to rise up too.
Yeah. And I think the thing with Betts, I mean, there's no doubting the athleticism that he has. And I mean, he's truly a special athlete. And like you said, I think it's just it's a focus thing. It's motivation. It's the kinds of things that, Matt Rule and he, I'm sure, have talked about quite a bit in those face-to-face meetings. You mentioned Garcia Castaneda. It seems like ages ago that he caught the first touchdown of the 2022 season way, way back when in Dublin. He hit the portal in October, having not played in 4 games, or having maintained the red shirt. Yesterday morning, we wake up and he has removed his name from the transfer portal where he had been for the better part of a few months, and is now evidently going through, things with Nebraska's football team, including volunteering yesterday, I guess. So good for him. But another guy who I think it's probably fair to say didn't mesh particularly well with Mickey Joseph, or at least the way that things were set up last season on Nebraska's offense. But he's going to get a shot. Rule and his staff are going to give him a chance and see where things are. And I mean, going back to last spring, he was a guy that the three of us, we were pretty intrigued by in terms of his big play potential and what he brings to the table.
Yeah, no question. You saw it the opening game. He's pretty elusive in space. Like, he was involved in the weird play where Casey bought like 5 extra seconds and then ended up being like a 58-yard play. But he also it was kind of ended up being a bummer for him, but he fumbled, of course, inside the 15, and it ended up being pretty costly. Some would say he didn't fumble. But on that play, if people remember, he made like 3 or 4 guys miss, it seemed like, before the mishap occurred. And I thought, like, wow, that guy's pretty exciting with the ball in his hands. So I was kind of looking forward to seeing more of that. I remember even after that first game writing a pretty big feature about him that appeared like Friday before the second game. Like you're thinking like, okay, here's a story of someone who's going to take off. And then it just went silent. Like,
Yeah.
did he have an injury of some sort there a little bit? Or was there?
I don't know. He only had one more catch. And yeah, it just I mean, based on comments on social media, from people said they were members of his family, things didn't sound like they were particularly rosy between him and the staff. But
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, you sit in the portal, and I think sometimes it makes sense to stay and give it a shot where you are, and especially as we said with Nebraska's need at wide receiver, and two, I mean, with Betts and Kemp and Garcia Castaneda, you're kind of getting to what Marcus Satterfield was talking about of looking for a little bit different type of receiver, because you have a guy in Kemp that's a little bit more of that kind of slot guy, the veteran that's, I think I would probably regard him more as kind of a chain mover versus a guy that's going to take the top off of a defense. You have somebody that when he's at his best in Xavier Betts, who, can be among the best athletes on the roster or even in the league if he develops well. And then Garcia Castaneda, I mean, he's the kind of guy that you can send him deep and he can take the top off of defense. So you don't know where those guys are going to be given their layoff, but I mean, you're at least adding guys with Power 5 experience and potential, which I think, you can at least count on that a little bit more than maybe kind of rolling the dice in the portal. Maybe I'm wrong.
No, they've done a good job in the last month with Kemp, Betts, and Garcia Castaneda. Of there's some proven stuff there. Like I feel like there's stuff on the resume where it's just about if you get the focus right and the connection off the field right, the on the field talents are there with all those guys, and so that's really what it's going to come down to. And I think it's easier right now for, like, I got to ask this, like, well, is that tough if Garcia Castaneda entered the portal in October and now you try to come back to your team, or Betts from last spring is trying to do this? What do other guys think? I sort of think most guys will be like, if you're all in and you can show me you're all in, let's go. Because I think that's more the climate we're in, first off, because everybody that's in college football is so used to all the portal stuff happening around them and guys kind of looking what's over here, what's over there, that I just don't think it's that big a deal anymore as it used to be 10 years ago. If a guy left for 4 months and comes back, and he's going to have to show it that he's all in and that he wants it. And that's what's going to matter. But also the fact that it's this first year staff, it's sort of a fresh start for everybody too. So I think that makes it easier in this case, where, like, if it were year 3 or 4 of a staff and these guys, left for a while and came back, maybe there'd be a little bit of a different angle to it. But I don't think it's going to be a thing. I just think it's like, okay, this is a whole new collection under a new staff. Everybody starts blank. Let's go.
Yeah.
That's what I think it's going to be like.
Yeah. Well, and we'll probably get into this a little bit once we get into February and a little bit closer to spring ball. But I mean, you just look at the number of scholarship guys they've got on the roster right now, and they've got to get down to 85 by the time August rolls around. I mean, it's going to be a very interesting spring, a very competitive spring, where guys are pretty much playing for roster spots. I think that's fair to say. I mean, I think that's kind of where they're at. And I know that this coaching staff is telling recruits, come down and see spring practices. They're talking about how physical it's going to be already. They're telling recruits how competitive it's going to be. So I think that's a little bit of an indication that, the staff is not going to kind of dip the toe in the water, so to speak, this spring. I think they're going to be really giving guys a chance to compete. And I do think, these guys that are coming back to the team are going to have just as good of a shot as, guys that maybe stuck it out last year.
Yeah. And also, if you're a young guy, you can look at Rule's track record at Baylor and Temple, and, he's a builder, and a guy who's a true builder is going to allow himself in certain cases to play young guys to continue with that process. Like, not be afraid to put a freshman or a first-year guy out there if they feel like he deserves it. And there are cases of that at his previous college stop. So I think if I'm a new player, you don't have to be just like a third or fourth year guy out of the portal, I think, to necessarily find the field. So that I think should fire up the guys who are right out of high school, which is an interesting component to college sports now, because I feel like some of those guys who are coming out of high school, there is a little bit of what about us sometimes, because there's so much talk about the portal and you can go fill these immediate needs with guys who have been somewhere else in college. But sometimes there's a reason why those guys were in the portal. You got to remember that. And these guys coming out of high school, it's a fresh beginning for them. And you really got to build that up. And so I think we'll see some young players. I don't know who they're going to be. I wouldn't dare name them, but I think there's going to be guys right out of high school that contribute in some way on this team next year, and they'll take their lumps. But I think, Matt Rule has done that before, and would probably be willing to do it again, I'm guessing.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, you were mentioning snap counts for what MJ Sherman had at Georgia. I mean, you do get the experience of the practices and the conditioning and all that other stuff, but when you're actually talking about real game snaps and having to be relied on, I mean, like a guy like Elijah Judy doesn't have a ton more of experience than a Riley Van Poppel in terms of game reps. So that is something I think you're right. I think that does get forgotten a little bit when you're kind of moving the pieces around on a potential roster. So is there anything else we need to hit on? That I'm sure there's probably going to be 10 more things we have to cover out of the portal in the next couple days, but anything else come to your mind?
No, I mean, it is a fascinating time. I feel like recruiting wise, this staff is going to be really interesting, because I feel like different guys have very strong ins to places that were once very good in Nebraska long ago, but haven't been as much. Like I've written before about like New Jersey, and how this is the place of like Rich Glover and Rozier and guys like Baron Miles came out of New Jersey. And this was once, great for Nebraska. And yes, the Huskers have gotten players out of that area with previous staffs, but I feel like it's going to be another level with this staff. And then Texas, I mean, the moves they're making, with their staff members who are closely tied in with Texas and all the relationships they have down there, I'd be a little annoyed if I were Texas or Texas A&M or Texas Tech or Baylor right now. And I'd say that as a compliment to Rule's crew, because they're going to be in the equation now. Nebraska's going to recruit like that's almost like a home state school because they know it so well. So the Texas thing, the New Jersey thing, California being more in play, we're seeing a little bit now with Tony White, and I think that's going to happen more and more. That's really interesting to me, just those like three states, how we've kind of talked about them on a surface level, but I think it's going to be something bigger now.
Texas especially, I think.
Yeah.
Texas and Texas A&M are always going to be kind of right. They're going to be at the top and kind of get their pick of guys. But if you can get competitive in that next group, but like you said, with Baylor, with Tech, TCU probably is recruiting at a higher level now than they were before based on kind of what they've done. But you can find guys in that next kind of tier down that can be difference makers and can be, talented players that, maybe, Bo Pelini's staff was trying to get out of Ohio, or Mike Riley's staff was trying to pull out of California. So I think there's room there. Matt Rule is in Texas this morning with Bob Wager kind of getting around in different places. And they're still not done in 2023. You said that Ismail Smith Flores from Bob Wager's old stomping grounds at Arlington Martin. He's coming up for an official visit this weekend. Demetrius Bell, a wide receiver from Tennessee, is coming in for an official visit. So they're not moved on to 2024 completely yet either. So I think you're going to see even more additions to what Nebraska's got going into the next signing day, which I believe is February 1st is the Wednesday. So keep it locked to Husker247 for all of that from the weekend. Anything else, Brian, before we sign off?
I don't think so. I there will be plenty by the next time we're up, I'm sure. But yeah, those were the main topics at hand, and it's busy, and busy's good though. There's an energy that is easy to pick up on, and it's fun to cover when there's an energy like that.
For sure. And Nebraska's assistant coaches are going to continue their 2x2 with the media, like a Noah's Ark media situation. It sounds like. So we'll have that recruiting coverage, basketball coverage. Basketball has Ohio State, Penn State, and Minnesota.
We're at next week.
Yeah,
Northwestern, I believe.
Northwestern. Sorry. Yeah,
on Tuesday. Yeah.
So
I think
busy week of basketball. We'll have all that. We'll know who they play when they play them. Baseball practice starting next week. So keep it locked to Husker247. We'll have all that for you, and maybe another podcast later this week.